Affirmative action, again, as I've been saying so many times, it fights racism with racism. It is outright immoral to quantify individual racism like affirmative action does.
Where we, as a society, have an obligation to help mitigate the effects of the injustices caused by racial inequality and to help close the gaps that have formed over centuries of inequity. And that is why, in the world that we exist in today, we need affirmative action.
Yeah, I'm still going down. I'll be falling for a long time. I so innocent. I didn't know you had a bad time.
Welcome again to Disagree to Agree, a channel where high schoolers get a chance to debate each other over controversial issues. This is our second podcast, and today's discourse will address affirmative action, which has been a controversial topic recently. Our first podcast touched on the eccentric UBI proposal to alleviate the chaos brought from the pandemic. My name is Ashik Bhattacharya, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. On the side of the pro, affirmative action will be Isha Singh, arguing why affirmative action is beneficial to alleviating the education gap and the racial inequities. And with the stance of anti-affirmative action will be Jay Bhatia, arguing that a system which merits people based on the color of their skin is abhorrent. Today, we will dive into the logic behind arguments for and against affirmative action and offer you diverse perspectives on both sides. I will be asking questions directed towards specific panelists, and they're encouraged to keep their answers concise. In addition, they will also have opportunities to respond to each other in other questions. So let's begin. My first question is directed towards both of you. Definitions are always going to be important to establish, and I want to ask both of you, what exactly is affirmative action, and what are the principles behind it? And what have been specific implementations we have seen so far? Isha, please answer first, and Jay, if you have any extra definitions, feel free to add on.
Okay, so affirmative action is basically like a policy or a program that seeks to address past racial discrimination in our country and its effects on modern society, effects like inequality in education. And it takes active measures to ensure equal opportunity, and what we're going to be talking about today will mostly be in college admissions.
And yeah, I'll agree with that definition.
Okay, my second question is to only Isha. When discussing affirmative action, people often agree that racial inequities are something that need to be alleviated. But is affirmative action the right and best way? Is a system which discriminates by the color of the skin just?
So affirmative action basically seeks to alleviate some of the generational sufferings of certain minorities by accounting for their earlier under-resourcing in the admissions processes. And this can be seen in many ways, like inequality in lower education, like I said before. It's not necessarily about attacking the root cause of these problems. It's more about leveling the playing field in a way that gives minorities equal chances. Affirmative action also supplements other initiatives fighting inequality in America. It doesn't just act alone. And the way it does this by taking into consideration different challenges students from certain backgrounds may have faced. Because in America, race is often linked to a worsened primary education and fewer resources, affirmative action just seeks to consider this in the admissions process.
All right, so now the third question is going to be to Jay, but responses will be allowed. So if someone's parent had a strong education, their children are more likely to be born into wealthy conditions and also receive a strong education. If someone's parents were uneducated, then those conditions more often than not also pass on to their children. So essentially what proponents of affirmative action call the education gap is ever widening. The educated become more educated and the uneducated never get the opportunity to take the first step. So my question for you is, if someone is born into an area with inadequate education, how would you even out the playing field and make sure the cycle of a lack of privilege is not perpetuated?
Okay, so I see what you say about the education gap. However, in the wording of your question, you say that you misconstrue affirmative action to be something that discriminates by socioeconomic status. And what you're basically saying is that there's a higher correlation with socioeconomic status than to education than there is between race and education. So basically, affirmative action only discriminates by race. It doesn't discriminate by socioeconomic status. And we agreed in the beginning that in our definition, what Isha said, that affirmative action seeks to end racial discrimination, which is not socioeconomic status. What I say is that, let's say I'm an Asian from a low socioeconomic status background. I'm automatically at a disadvantage because I'm Asian, and also because I'm a low socioeconomic status background. However, affirmative action doesn't take this into account. They only take into account that the fact that I'm Asian, so I'm basically at a double disadvantage. Here's my second response. The answer to making sure that the lack of privilege doesn't perpetuate is by solving the root cause of the problem, which is unequal education. Affirmative action is a lazy and it is a temporary response to a very complicated policy problem. And I don't think that it's evening out any playing field, because even with affirmative action, minorities are still at the bottom. If we really wanted to help our community as a whole, we need to fix the flawed education system that is harming minorities in the first place.
Okay, so I actually have a response to that. So I have two things to say. So first, racial discrimination isn't just about socioeconomic status, Jay. There's also implicit bias at play here, and I think we all know this. So students from the same socioeconomic status, but of different races, also may not be treated equally. Like implicit biases cannot be measured. So for example, if you use socioeconomic status, there might be like an African-American student who comes from a high socioeconomic status but still faces implicit bias in their education and therefore is put at a different disadvantage. And this implicit bias can't be quantified. So affirmative action also takes those disadvantages into account. And the second thing is that, yes, as I said before, affirmative action doesn't solve for the root cause of these problems. But in the world that we exist in today, these root problems do exist. So until we can solve these problems, until we can eliminate this type of discrimination, affirmative action is still necessary to help alleviate some of those disadvantages.
Yeah, so my response to that is I totally see what you're saying about how there's like an implicit bias in our world. I totally agree with that. But what I'm saying is that affirmative action is putting down these privileged races. And the fact that we're labeling a race as privileged is totally wrong. What affirmative action is saying lies under the assumption that the model minority myth is not a myth. If I'm an Asian, like I'm discriminated against because I'm Asian, because I'm Indian. Like black people are like discriminated against because they're like black. So like affirmative action, like just because you're labeling races as privileged doesn't mean that they're not discriminated against. Like I can say that Asians I know are very discriminated against, and affirmative action does not take this into account. It actually makes it harder for Asians to get it.
All right, so moving on to the next question. So this is to each, our responses will be allowed. You say affirmative action is made to help disadvantaged people of color because of societal oppression that has existed historically and to some extent also exists today. If the statistics show that affirmative action is causing minorities to perform worse at the schools with a higher dropout rate, my question to you is, does affirmative action really support people of color if they get in easier but on average perform worse?
Okay, so yeah, that's actually a really good question. So the first thing I have to say is that we can't say that affirmative action is necessarily causing certain students to perform worse. And then again, I also ask you, like, what is the alternative? Like we've already established, we live in a world where the education system in general is very biased against people of certain minorities. And removing affirmative action would only make these like disparities and these inequalities even worse. I mean, like I said, affirmative action itself isn't causing a change in performance, right? Affirmative action is just compensating for an underlying problem, and removing that compensation will only tip the scales further.
Okay, so the alternative, as you're saying, like you said, there's like, what's the alternative? The answer to that is to weigh a student's success off socioeconomic status, not race. And this links back to the last question when Ishik asked me, like he said that like, oh, if you're born into a not wealthy family, like you will obviously not be educated. And the link there was between socioeconomic status. The link there was not between race. You can go ahead and say that there's a link between race and socioeconomic status, which I agree with, but this doesn't take into account, again, the fact that there might be a low socioeconomic status Asian student, or there might be a very high socioeconomic status African-American student.
Okay, so yeah, Jay, like that's a good point, but I'm just going to sort of restate what's already been said. So first of all, yes, there have been many studies that show that there is a very high correlation between race and socioeconomic status. And furthermore, if we move to a socioeconomic based like affirmative action program or something, it won't address other disadvantages that people of certain minorities face outside of just socioeconomic status. Like I said before, things such as day-to-day implicit biases that may seem insignificant in individual cases, but build up over time to have a significant impact on certain students. Those things wouldn't be considered at all in a system based off socioeconomic status.
Okay, so moving on to the next question. This is to Jay. There will be responses. It's an indisputable fact that historical oppression against minorities, people of color, and specifically African Americans have existed for the entirety of this country's history. Racist policies such as redlining segregation existed as recently as 60 years ago in the 1960s, and now what proponents of affirmative action argue is that these policies and institutions have essentially allowed certain races, specifically white Americans, to accumulate a humongous advantage over people of color. To counter the racism of the past, is it not okay to give a slight advantage, especially in the educational field based on race, to those who have been unjustly historically oppressed?
Okay, so I have a couple of responses off the top of my head. So first, on whether or not it's okay to fight racism with racism, I say no, it's not okay to fight racism with racism, because by doing this, you're basically reversing the course of what we fought for in the past. And second, on giving people that have been discriminated against a slight advantage with affirmative action, I say that affirmative action is not a slight advantage, as there's evidence showing that Asians can be docked more than 100 SAT points when being considered for a college compared to others who get three times that boost in the positive direction. I argue that it is far more important to alleviate the neighborhoods that are underprivileged and to ensure that opportunity exists everywhere. And an example I can give you is like opportunity zones, which basically plunges billions of dollars into underdeserved communities, which is what we should be doing, which is tackling the root problem. Third, on affirmative action helping Black people in the US, I argue that it doesn't actually help them in the long run. Evidence has shown that these policies hurt African Americans significantly, because more than 50% of African American law students, many who have been admitted to pursuing to affirmative action policies, were in the bottom 10% of their class, and the dropout rate among these students was more than twice of that of their white peers, specifically 19.3% compared to 8.2%.
Okay, so Jay, first I have to disagree with one thing that you said there. You say that affirmative action is racism, and I have to disagree with that. We don't classify affirmative action as an active form of racism. Racism is defined as discrimination against people based on their race, amongst other things. And affirmative action isn't discriminating against some people because of their races. It's more focused on helping boost others up because of disadvantages they may face because of their race. So affirmative action isn't actually like a form of discrimination. And it's also, more importantly, a means to fix the past. It's also very clear that in race-blind admissions where race isn't considered at all, we see that not that many African American students are admitted. And that is because existing data suggests that race-conscious admissions policies are the main factors keeping overall enrollment roughly representative of America's racial demographics. An analysis from 2015 actually found that colleges in states with affirmative action bans were less representative of the state's demographics than colleges that are allowed to consider race. So basically, affirmative action helps us see more equal representation of certain races in colleges. And as a response to your idea about opportunity zones zones sound like a great idea. However, they can only be part of a solution. And furthermore, we're not even sure of whether or not opportunity zones will actually work to create equity. Like I've said multiple times, in a world where inequality still exists, we still need affirmative action to balance out some of that inequality. So even though there are potential solutions, until we can be sure that one of those solutions will positively work and it actually does go into effect and it does work, we still need affirmative action.
Okay, so the next question is going to be only to Isha. A very important value to establish when discussing affirmative action is what type of diversity do you value? Is it the diversity of socioeconomic background, intellectual diversity, or as proponents of affirmative action argue, racial diversity? Why is racial diversity important to the organization as a whole and to our societal values?
Okay, so Aishik, I think most people can agree that diversity as a whole is beneficial. All kinds of diversity are helpful. However, racial diversity is a very important form of diversity in the sense that when you see racial diversity, we also see intellectual diversity and socioeconomic diversity begin to naturally appear. And this can be seen in a 2014 study that analyzed 1.5 million scientific papers. And they found that papers that were written by diverse groups received more citations and have higher impact factors than papers written by people from the same ethnic group. So basically what we see when we increase racial diversity is, one, we see other types of diversity naturally begin to increase as well. And two, racial diversity does have major positive impacts, as we can see in this Harvard study.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is only for Jay. If you don't advocate for affirmative action, would you agree that you are automatically defaulting to a colorblind admission system? Do you value racial equality? And if so, can a colorblind system create that? And does a colorblind system account for historical oppression?
Okay, that's a very interesting question because, again, I do value racial equality. However, affirmative action, again, it just fights racism with racism. As I've said multiple times throughout this debate, we need to rework the system, and colleges should take students' socioeconomic status, not their race, into account. This would make sure that we are not unfairly giving anyone an advantage or disadvantage. And yes, this would be better than a non-colorblind system. We can look to our education system, for example. The grades you get in school are colorblind. They have nothing to do with our race. So why do we have to give a certain race an advantage when we're looking at college admissions if we don't give them an advantage in their grades or in literally any other part of the education system? Why don't we help the people that need it when they need it instead of trying to account for this later? This is what I mean when I call affirmative action a lazy solution. If we validly rework the system, there will obviously be racial diversity.
Okay, so the next question is going to be only Isha. So would the philosophy of affirmative action apply outside of college applications? And I want to present you with an interesting hypothetical. Let's say I were to hire a surgeon at my local hospital. Now I have one Asian and one African American applicant. Now as a hospital, I want to hire the best possible surgeon. So like in college applications, I want the best student. But we understand that one person may have gone through certain difficulties in their lifetime. So using the same logic of affirmative action, would a certain race be given a favorable view in this situation when we have a situation pertaining to life or death?
So actually, Ishak, I would say no, you wouldn't. And that's because hiring a surgeon is different than considering a student for college. So when you're hiring a surgeon or when you're hiring anybody for a job, you're looking for somebody with a certain skill set to perform a job for you. However, when you're considering a student for college, it's a completely different story. You're not just considering the students' like skills and learning so far, you're learning their qualifications to learn. So you're considering their qualifications to learn a skill, not to perform a skill. Things you consider in a student shouldn't just be how well they can study textbooks or take tests. You would also consider how enthusiastic they are, how driven they are, and how eager they are to learn that material. These factors cannot be fairly portrayed in college admissions or in grades. For example, a student of a disadvantaged minority with a 3.6 GPA may have had to work significantly harder than other students with a 3.8 in order to overcome implicit biases in their classrooms. So qualifications to learn are very different from qualifications to perform a job. And second, you can't really see a student's qualifications to learn just from grades and other factors on college admissions because of implicit biases, and this is where affirmative action comes in.
Okay, so now this next question is going to be for Jay, just a clarifying area. Earlier, you had discussed how in order for affirmative action to help certain people, it puts down other people. Could you please take some time to sort of clarify how that logic works?
Okay, so what I said before is that it's a fact. Affirmative action is racist. That's literally a fact, because what it's doing is it's tagging certain races like whites or white people or Asian people. Like if you have that background, you're tagged as this like privileged person who has like a great like educational background, a good socioeconomic status, like basically following the Mongol minority myth, which is a myth. It's been proved. You can search it up. And basically what it says is that if you're like Indian or Asian, then you're like a model minority, which means that you are automatically like extremely smart, like you're a perfect like citizen, you have a high socioeconomic status, which is obviously not true. Not every Asian person in this country is going to be like a millionaire. That's totally false. And if you want to search it up, you can on your own time. But I'm saying right now, the model minority myth is a myth. And affirmative action is going along with this myth. We're marking certain races as privileged and we're marking certain races as underprivileged. If you tell me that this is not racism, I will outright disagree with you. And again, I can bring up the my little like hypothetical of like if an Asian person has a low socioeconomic status background, they're at a double disadvantage. And I can bring another example. If you're African American, affirmative action puts you at an advantage. So if you're African American and you have a high socioeconomic status background and you have good education, you have a good family, all that, then you are actually at a like double advantage. Because first of all, you have a high socioeconomic status background, so you have a good education. And second of all, affirmative action is still benefiting you. And I don't feel like this is like these like little like these little like quirks in the system of affirmative action make it non-viable.
All right, thank you. So my next question is to both of you. In admissions, is the level of opportunity important to know? If yes, if income is already considered, why would you go one step further to look at race? I'd like Isha to answer first and Jay to answer second.
Okay, so Ishak, I'm going to go ahead and say that yes, the level of opportunity is very important to consider because, like I've mentioned before, students may be super enthusiastic to learn about a topic. They may be like really driven, but if they never had the opportunities to show that, then they would not that would not be represented in their college admissions. And why would we go one step further to consider race? Well, like I've also said before, there are other disadvantages students face outside of socioeconomic status due to race, which are implicit biases. Discrimination against certain races isn't something that can be quantified or measured. For example, if a student of color has teachers throughout high school that have implicit biases against them, as a result, they may get much lower grades. And that's not something that we can viably measure in any way. We know for a fact that at large, society has major biases against many minorities, and that the biases against people based on their race are some of the worst that we face in our country. We should consider race not just because of differences in opportunity, but also because of all of the non-quantifiable challenges that people of disadvantaged minorities undoubtedly face throughout their education and their lives.
Okay, so as I've said before, affirmative action discriminates against Asians, and not just Asians, but other races as well. But I'm just using Asians as an example in this debate. And Asians are also discriminated outside of affirmative action. Affirmative action basically ignores the racism of the races that it does not benefit. It would be nice if we could have a way to measure disadvantage, but it is immoral to quantify an individual's past experiences.
So this question is for Isha. Responses will be allowed. If there are multiracial people applying to a college, how would affirmative action apply to them? For example, if a student is a quarter African American and 3/4 white, would they not receive benefits for being a quarter African American, even though they may have faced far fewer disadvantages because of it?
So I think this is actually a really good question. So I would say for now, schools should consider all races that a student is when they're applying. So they should consider if they are members of underrepresented minorities, and they should try to consider how much a student may have been affected by that, even if they are multiracial, in order to ensure that affirmative action is still benefiting students in the way that it should, but without furthering the divide that it seeks to bring together. So what I mean by this is, like, in your example where a student is 1/4 African American and 3/4 white, I mean, they probably wouldn't receive the same benefits as a student who is fully African American, but it would still be considered in the application under affirmative action.
Okay, so I have two responses to this. First of all, being multiracial is different from being fully one race, and the same racial disparities may not apply. I think it's very idiotic to assume that, like, if you're like 1/4 of a race, you get like 1/4 of their like benefits. That's just like, that whole sentence is pretty messed up to me. And second of all, we wouldn't even need to be talking about like a world with like taking into account multiracial like bias with like, if we didn't even have affirmative action in the first place. That's why we don't even need it. We can just take it out now.
Okay, so now to close off the podcast, we will allow each side to give a closing statement. So Isha, to finish off, can you give a closing statement on why the world with affirmative action is better than a world without it?
Okay, so Ishak, in my view, the reason we need affirmative action is simple. We live in a world of inequality. That is a fact. Race plays a large role in America in inequities and lower pre-college education, even though it shouldn't. From its ties to socioeconomic status to immeasurable implicit biases that I have kept bringing up throughout this conversation, students of certain races may face disadvantages in their lives that affect their on-paper qualifications for college. However, these students are faced with disadvantages over their lives that they don't have any control over. This doesn't mean that students of a certain race should get fewer opportunities in higher education. Jay keeps bringing up a really excellent point that in a world without racial disparities, we wouldn't need affirmative action, and I agree. But the fact is, the world we live in does have racial inequality, which is why we need affirmative action to help balance those effects out. We need to alleviate centuries of racism and bias that have put these students at a disadvantage in the first place. Yes, affirmative action does not solve the root problem. And again, in a world where there were no inequalities, yes, affirmative action would not be necessary. However, until we get to the point where we as a society have no racial biases against people and no biases against people due to their race or ethnicity, we have an obligation to help mitigate the effects of the injustices caused by racial inequality and to help close the gaps that formed over centuries of inequity. And that is why, in the world that we exist in today, we need affirmative action.
All right, and same question for you, Jay. Can you give any lasting comparative analysis on why your world without affirmative action would be better than a world with it?
Okay, so affirmative action, again, as I've been saying so many times, it fights racism with racism. We're basically labeling a race as privileged or labeling a race as underprivileged. I do understand the general intent and idea behind affirmative action. Like, I understand that the intent is good. However, when we apply it, we're basically putting down a race to benefit another race. By fixing the root problem that is the education system, we can effectively rebuild a non-biased system in the future. Some people like Isha may say that this can take time, and I'm not denying that it will take time, because everything beautiful and good in life takes hard work. And humans are programmed to be rewarded when we really work for something. So no, this won't be easy. No, it's not something that can be solved right now. I agree with that. But what we need to do is work towards a reliable solution that can guarantee that we are making progress. Some people may still oppose my proposed plan because in the time that it takes to rework the system, we won't have any filter to benefit those that have been discriminated against. And that makes sense, which is why I propose that until we rework our system, colleges should take students' socioeconomic status and not their race into account. This would make sure that we are not unfairly giving anyone an advantage or giving anyone a disadvantage. And on a final note, it is outright immoral to quantify individual racism like affirmative action does. We need to give people the help they need when they need it, instead of trying to somehow predict their adversity later. I advocate for the quality. I advocate for the more needed solution to cut off affirmative action.
All right, thank you. Thank you to everyone that has just tuned in to our podcast on affirmative action. Make sure to subscribe, follow us on our Instagram, and if you have any suggestions or any topics we should do in the future, please feel free to DM us. Thank you again.
And so the story goes, love grows and then it gets cut down, then crumbles like a rose and decomposes in the ground. It's tragic, I suppose, like dominoes, how it goes down. The teardrops on the clothes, they're being knocked all over the ground. But fear not, there's no fear, my dear, cause here it all works out. The clothes will dry, the tears will disappear, and from the ground a rose will rise, and from the skies the sun will break the clouds. A rose will rise and blue skies will surround.